It's a pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on operational excellence for utilities. The idea of this webinar is to give you a chance to interact with the guest editors of the special issue so that you can calibrate your papers to have an excellent fit with the special issue, particularly given that the topic could not be more relevant in the world that we are currently facing. So it's a pleasure in the name of Journal of Operations Management to welcome you. Tyson, I'll pass it over to you.
Welcome, everyone. We put out an annual call for special issues, and usually that happens around April, May. People send them in May and June. And in that call, it's open call. We're interested in any special issue topic that fits the journal. But this year we had put out a couple, or I guess last year when the call went out, we'd put out a couple of areas of particular interest because we think they're understudied in the world of OM. And one of those was in the area of utilities. So we were delighted to get this excellent proposal for a special issue in the world of utilities. And we're excited to see what can develop in this area. I think we've got a small group here, but I think that's indicative of a good conversation that we could have. And then hopefully this group will grow as the word continues to get out about the special issue deadline coming up later this year. Suzanne and I plan to let our special issue guest editors run this session. We're just here to say hello and welcome. And so we're going to hand it over to them.
Okay, thanks very much. I'll start. Thank you, Suzanne, Tyson. Welcome everyone on behalf of my fellow guest editors, Henk Akkermans, Wendy van der Valk and Luc van Wassenhoven. My name is Finn Winstra, and I'll start with introducing the scope and the background of this webinar and a little bit the scope of the special issue before I hand over to Henk as a next speaker in line. The purpose of the webinar, we have lots of webinars to attend, even though in some countries, as the Netherlands today, all of the working from home restrictions are being lifted. So, but still we have lots of webinars going around. So what is the reason for organizing yet another webinar? Well, we think, given what Tyson already mentioned about the let's say the scarcity of research in public infrastructure and utilities, it would be useful to, in addition to the call for papers, tell you a little bit about the background of this special issue and the scope that we're seeking to define. We want to share with you a couple of the next steps that we have in mind, such as a couple of conferences that will be present in different forms and shapes. And primarily, we want to reserve at least the second half hour of this meeting to discuss potential submission ideas that you might have and other questions that you have about the special issue. So the call for papers, as you've probably seen already, but you'll find the link here on the slide. So why this special issue? And Suzanne already mentioned it briefly. It's a highly topical and current issue. Many countries, not just the Netherlands as pictured here in the bottom left, but also in the US, in Germany, lots of countries are facing substantial challenges to revitalize their public infrastructures. Not only to do that in a cost-effective fashion, but also in a timely fashion. Many countries have delayed maintenance programs, for instance, and really need to speed up their renovation or construction timelines. Another development that is taking place, not just in public infrastructure assets, but other assets as well, is the possibilities enabled by digitalization or digitization. This could facilitate systemic asset management in many different ways, and my colleagues will come back to that. But it seems that not all organizations in the supply chain, for instance, are aligned on these possibilities, and even not internally within organizations. We see quite some problems in aligning the interest and priorities for these kind of possibilities. As already referred to by Tyson as well, there is in this topic of infrastructure and operational excellence has seen little interest from operations and supply chain management research, not only in Journal of Operations Management, but also in other journals. There is obviously a lot of interest from engineering disciplines, but less so in our own home base. We also think there's a particular need or potential for more empirical studies. There are quite some studies, maybe not in OM, but of the technical possibilities of digitalization, etc. But we think that implementation studies could be, and empirical studies more widely, could really add to the body of knowledge. So in sum, we see opportunity for concerted effort, not only of academics within our field, but also across other fields such as the engineering that I referred to earlier. And in the end, we don't want to only advance science, but particularly also practice and policy in this highly topical field. And with that, I like to hand over to Henk for the next slide.
Yes, thank you, Finn. So this call and this topic is these days and these weeks so very clearly important, where it before was less visible. Without the proper electricity infrastructure or infrastructure in general, people literally die as we speak. So. But that's a wholly different dimension. And when we made the slides and the call, it's a more modest and certainly less urgent call for more research and practice. But I think in the past we were easily forgiven as a field, as indeed also as citizens in general, that we didn't pay much attention to utilities and infrastructure. You know why? They just worked. There was the road, there was electricity. When you open the tap, water comes out. But these obvious truths no longer are truths, and we've seen that in many instances in the advanced world. And part of it comes from the fact that they're aging. Perhaps so it's not so easy to foresee what actually the impact of this is, but it is huge. So when we talk about utilities, it's all over the place. It's transport, it's energy, it's water, it's waste. And when we talk about the management of these utilities, also it's really broad. It's also planning, acquisition, operations, and maintenance. So that's a really broad topic. It is really a part of, I suppose, negotiation between us, the special editors, and possible contributors to this special issue, what's really out of scope, because there's often an angle with asset management. So it's clear that healthcare services and really public transportation services are good examples where I think, yeah, that's not what we mean, but in general, it's a broader web that we're casting, I think. Can I have the next slide, Finn? Yeah. So there is the first bullet point is really underlying all of this. Since it's so really broad and it's all over society, it's understandable but harmful that the approach to managing these technical assets that are essential for running these utilities is very fragmented, and what we are very fragmented. And what we really need is a much broader, more systemic perspective on it that focuses on the long lifetime of these assets. The previous slide had a picture of the canals in Amsterdam, very much a tourist attraction, perhaps, but also hundreds of years old. But there is also a systemic life cycle perspective for the offshore windmill farms, which mostly still have to be built, but they also need this systemic life cycle perspective. Now, what's the main reason for the higher urgency in asset management from utility is from the perspective of society, is the growing gap between the capacity that is needed to maintain these assets and the capacity that's available. Because the capacity needed is growing and the capacity available is shrinking. The capacity needed is growing because these assets are aging. And when they're aging, then the typical curve of number of failures or need for maintenance is the typical bathtub curve with a really exponential growth towards the later stages of life. So the average bridge in the Netherlands is 45 years, and many of them are 60 years old, and they were never designed for such long periods. In the US, the situation is even more grim. So there is a really big problem with aging, more capacity is needed. And at the same time, the workforce that has been doing this maintenance and this asset management is retiring. Average age there is also over 55 often of the workforce there. So how to meet the gap? Well, for an economist, the only way if capacity to solve this, if the workforce is shrinking, then the productivity needs to go up. And there the digital world comes in with potential solutions to increase that productivity. And it's all over the place. It's with sensors, it's data analytics, it's augmented reality, twins, robots, all these examples mentioned. It's the whole industry 4.0 advanced manufacturing shebang that you can apply in this area, and that is being applied now technically. But as often as we also study in operations, if there's technology, that doesn't mean it's being applied. And if it is applied, it will change operations and change strategy, change organization. So this is now, I suppose, the amount of technology available to provide productivity enhancements is much lower than the amount of technologies actually being deployed. And the gap is then implementation, organization, operations. So there is a significant challenge there to leverage digitization, really from a technology management perspective, that it actually will work. When stuff works well, these assets, they are cleaner, they last longer, so they need to be replaced less often. Their maintenance requires less traveling, fewer spare parts, less waste, that they can serve their, you need less of them because they have a higher uptime. So all these areas mean higher sustainability, lower footprint. So and that's a real significant impact on society that is often ignored. Simply by managing, if you have 100 billion worth of investment in the public infrastructure, and all of a sudden you only have to, in terms of renovating, and all of a sudden you only have to do 70 billion. That's in itself just a 30% saving of all sorts of new stuff, all sorts of new CO2 footprint that can be avoided. So there's a big impact of operational excellence in asset management of utilities on sustainability. Now, the reason that much of this is not happening now has to do with the money and the law. So with incentives, we have service ecosystems emerging in maintenance, because very rarely these publicly owned asset owners rarely actually do their own maintenance. That's being outsourced. But then what are the incentives to these contractors is that to do the work. So which means that implicitly you give them an incentive to spend many hours on this, to wait until it's broken. Or is it performance-based? But what performance then? What is a good performance-based contract, an output-based contract between the contractor and the service provider? What's the role of the OEMs in here, or the original builders? How can we align all these incentives? What's the role of the law in this? Because these are publicly owned things. Sometimes you need privacy-related information there. So it's really this ecosystem idea of going beyond the supply chain, but also including other parties that are important for getting, well, actually delivering the service and aligning all their incentives. And in general, we are just scratching the surface there. I think there our colleagues in law are more used to dealing with these very complex settings, but from us simple supply chain folks, we're sometimes overwhelmed. And again, here it would be great if our our special issue would have generate a little improvement in our knowledge of how to do this well. So on all these topics I just mentioned, we would welcome contributions. And with that, I hand over to the next guest editor, which is Wendy.
Yes, thank you, Henk. Apologies, I was waiting for your cue, but I was not immediately ready to unmute. Right, a quick introduction. My name is Wendy van der Valk. I work as a Navy endowed professor in purchasing and supply chain management at Tilburg University. And this is exactly the angle that I'm going to take when I talk about utilities. So Henk already mentioned a couple of the issues that I'm also very interested in from my own background, looking into interorganizational collaborations and the challenges associated with that. So if we look at the establishment of these infrastructural assets, or art pieces, as some of our Dutch practitioner colleagues tend to call them, artworks, they usually come into be in these large interorganizational projects. And Henk already mentioned the life cycle perspective being important, and that obviously also involves the involvement of many different disciplines, both within a buying organization, but also on the side of the various suppliers. These interorganizational projects usually involve public organizations and private organizations that need to collaborate somehow. And generally, these organizations tend to be quite different in the way that they are organized, in the values and the performance aspects that they tend to emphasize. So in terms of aligning these various parties, whether it's in a dyad, whether it's in a broader chain perspective, or in a network or ecosystem perspective, is usually very challenging. And we find that organizations are also trying to move away from this one-off project kind of approach, project by project approach, towards something that looks more like a program, and trying to figure out ways in which they, as buying entities, can put suppliers in their strength. What can they do to make them shine? And working on more longer-term collaborations where they can actually deal with various suppliers, have a certain area to offer, and can mix with certain suppliers to deal with the challenges in these specific areas. So we see that, for example, also happening with the crumbling bridges and canal walls in Amsterdam. Now, another trend which is very important, that's also something that Henk just quickly mentioned, performance-based he talked about. We see generally, I think, in procurement a trend towards performance-based or outcome-based contracting, where you can debate in what situations this kind of approach is actually most appropriate and helpful, perhaps not in all situations, but it's also a trend that we strongly see here. And what I think is very interesting here is that outcomes perhaps here are not only limited anymore to purely functional aspects. Broader welfare notions come into play here, public values. So to what extent actually does a new asset that's being constructed and the way that it's operated, to what extent does it contribute to value for society at large, for users? If we think about mobility, affordability, safety, accessibility, all these aspects need to be carefully balanced, and that greatly affects the type of contracts that are being issued, but also the way that suppliers actually organize their operations. And organizations seem to be struggling with that. So there is increased awareness, increased acknowledgement for these kinds of broader notions of value, but how that actually comes into play into actual organizational decision-making, and how you can actually value those benefits and make trade-offs, that's something that's still quite challenging and still remains rather vague. So it would be really interesting to look into those kinds of issues. Now, another aspect that seems very interesting when we talk about these assets is what it actually entails in terms of the division of rights to control and income. And I was actually debating with some of my colleagues in Twente the other day about this. If you actually hand over a piece of public road infrastructure to a supplier, and expect that supplier to make the arrangements to uphold it, et cetera, that actually also comes with additional certain rights. And the question that she actually posed was, if for whatever reason some kind of element of a raw material part of that road infrastructure, for example, surges in price, is then the supplier allowed to deconstruct the road and to take away the material and to put something else in place? So handing over these kinds of responsibilities and the rights that are associated with that can also actually, in quite extreme circumstances, but maybe there's even more common examples that you can think of, bring quite peculiar questions, give rise to peculiar questions. And how do you deal with that? How do we actually distribute the value that's being generated from these capital assets? There's also, in terms of a contracting perspective, not only obligations on the side of the suppliers, but also obligations on the rights on the side of users, who can usually be governed to some extent by the public buying organizations. So responsibilities on both sides to more or less try to increase the lifetime that infrastructure can be used, to make sure sustainability targets are being met, et cetera, et cetera. So also here, it's worthwhile to think about the rights associated with ownership. What does it entail in terms of control? What does it entail in terms of income, especially if we look at these more expanded contracts, which not only involve anymore a certain design and perhaps the fabrication of the artwork, but also the actual maintenance and operations for a long time to go. And then lastly, but there's many more points, but I tried to limit myself here to these 4 important angles. Henk also alluded to this notion of digital technologies. And what we actually find also is that aside from the technical challenges, but also the merits that data generated by technologies can bring, it's actually also quite challenging to incorporate that into buyer-supplier relationships and into contracting perspective. So, for example, quite recent work that we've been involved in has actually revealed that the extent to which organizations are able to incorporate the use of digital technologies and the use of this data that is generated and the purposes for which it will be used, et cetera, can still be quite challenging. Organizations have difficulty figuring out what is actually available, what could be available, what that could mean in terms of how they operate. Is it then data that is being generated by my asset, which is then my own? We actually found that from collaborations with our law colleagues that it's not the case. But is it the suppliers? What is ownership in this respect? So here we also see great challenges ahead for organizations to find out how they can best incorporate this notion of digitalization into contracting and hence leverage the potential of data. And with that, I would like to hand over to Luc.
Well, yes, thank you. You've heard a lot of different aspects already, different perspectives on this. So, let me complicate things by adding one more, which is the end of life. And most of my work has been in sustainability and circular economy and closed loop supply chains and so on. And when you look at long, life cycle utilities or assets, the end of life is very often an afterthought. Right? It is insufficiently included, and it might actually, if you don't do that properly, it might actually change the economical and the maintenance and economical perspectives. When we look at these very long life cycle type of assets, it's very easy now to make all sorts of pledges about what was going to happen 30 or 40 or 50 years from now. It's a bit like politicians talking about what they're going to do with CO2 footprints, right, and reduction of those. It's very non-committal. It's hard to measure. It's not, the reserves that are being made are very often, to do proper recycling at the end, are very often, largely insufficient, don't take into account increasing costs and so on. So there's a lot of issues there. And already, if you look at just, clean energy, well, is it really that clean, or does it have a dark side? We were looking at photovoltaic cells, and if you look at the new, all the new technologies that come in and the increase in efficiency of those cells, there may be an awful lot of cells that are going to be replaced way before the 30-year or 40-year life cycle. Now, Henk was talking about capacity. Well, there you get it, right? Recycling capacity today is not available to, recycle huge amounts of panels that would be replaced before their end of life. Those are things that happen, and we need to look into those. And operations management obviously allows you to build nice models around that and to see what the impact would be. And of course, in this case, if you recycle photovoltaic cells much easier and you don't have the capacity, much faster, I'm sorry, and you don't have the capacity, then we all know that the costs will skyrocket and it'll be a big issue. Right? Similar things can be said about wind energy, right? If you put your stuff very, very far away from the coast, it's going to be more expensive to maintain. It's going to be much more expensive to recycle at the end of life, and so on. So this is really about what I wanted to add to all the aspects that my colleagues have already explained. Now, if you talk about circular economy really thinks about the lifetime extension, proper reuse, proper recycling. But the key question that circular economy actually also raises is, how do you actually integrate those considerations effectively at the design stage? Because if you don't do it at that stage, you're going to be in trouble later. And so how do you integrate that? And going back to what Wendy was saying, who at the end of the day will be paying or responsible for proper design in the first place, but also proper disposal at the end? And there's a lot of uncertainties, a lot of things that are not clear legally, as well as a number of other issues. And all of those could be interesting topics for research and for the special issue. Now, I'll shut up here on this one because I think we've been long enough, and we can probably open it for questions. But let me talk a little bit about the road ahead. Don't hesitate to send a proposal, an extended abstract to us. We'd be happy to talk to you to see if it fits or how you can make it fit into the special issue. We will have special tracks and meet the guest editors at several upcoming conferences, as you can see there. I'm pretty sure you're interested very much in the timeline. So we were thinking about 31st of October for your submissions. There will be a first round of reviewing that, you should get your papers back by the end of January. There'll only be one major revision, so you'll get the chance to revise until the 30th of April. And, if it's going to be either reject or minor revision at that point in time. And then hopefully we can make the final decisions end of July. And that's pretty much up to Tyson and Suzanne, I think, how quickly they can get that in print or, electronically, as you prefer. So I think I'm done. Over to Finn again, I think, for the conversation, the question and answer. Thanks.
Luc, thanks to the other colleagues as well. Indeed, that brings us at almost exactly half an hour, as we sort of indicated, promised. There's been already a couple of questions in the chat. I'm happy to moderate those for now, and then I'll give the word to one of my colleagues on specific questions. A first question from Guo Wei, if I pronounce it correctly: dam construction, whether that is in the scope of the special issue. Yes, in principle, as long as there is an operations management angle to it, but maybe you want to explain your question a bit more.
Hello. Yeah, I'm on behalf of a group for this study. Myself, study area is statistics and applications, especially uncertainty theory. And there are people in the group who are doing the constructions of dams and study the stability of the dams. So I wonder if this is opportunity for them to develop a project or a paper that is related to the scope of this special issue. Their main idea, I think I will discuss with them, is to talk about their experience, basically the dams they work with in the past and up to now, to talk about the original construction, maybe some problems in the original construction, and then the maintenance problems, and in the future, what they are going to do as the management part. I think I do not know a lot of details about that. They are experts, I'm not, but my area is statistics. So I can talk to them about the details.
Can I take this one, Finn?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that it's a fantastic topic, dams. This is not a civil engineering journal and also not a civil engineering special issue. However, what is crucial, for instance, what Luc mentioned specifically, is design for maintenance, design for asset management. So this is not a topic about how to design a dam. But if the way that you design the dam has certain consequences for the maintenance, for instance, for the operations, that becomes more cumbersome, that there are certain things you find out afterwards that are not helpful, that becomes really interesting. So there has to be the link to the management of the asset, there has to be the link to the operations of the asset, and that may start in the civil engineering side. It should just not stop there, because then it's an engineering topic, which is fantastic, but just another journal.
Okay, thank you. I think I understand. The main thing is about the scope of the journal, JOM. It's like a operations, about operations and the management.
Yeah,
I'll
so
tell
it
them
has to
about
go beyond the civil engineering side of how to design a dam with all the power calculations and the toys. But as soon as it goes into this is, if you design a design, for instance, take Luc's example. Can you design a dam in a circular manner?
Okay.
So that actually after 30, 40 years, it becomes more, it becomes possible to reuse all the material? Or is there a way to design a dam so the maintenance becomes smarter? Can you include sensors in the building of the dam so that you can monitor it remotely so the operations becomes better? All that sort of considerations. So that starts at civil engineering, but goes into operations management.
Okay, thank you. So focus on the operations. Okay,
yes, please.
Okay, thank you.
And you're always welcome to together with your colleagues, maybe write a 2-3 page abstract of the intended paper.
Okay, letter of intent. Okay, we'll do that.
Yeah. And
we'll keep in contact. Keep in contact. Actually, this work will be a joint work between US and China.
Okay.
Actually, some friends are there in China. They work in this field, but I work with mostly with people in US, but sometimes I do work with them. So I hope can do a collaboration work with them and for a contribution for this special issue. And by the way, I just want to tell you a little bit more about my background, so you know what where I am. Basically, my area is statistics, but I've been working with environment management. Last year, we published a special issue with Natural Hazard. Natural Hazard is that journal, and we talk about the big data and the applications for. I think for treatment or management of the hazards, mostly like natural hazards, not human-made things. That's my area. We have been working in this area, environmental economics, for some time. So I think I can organize a paper for this special issue if that fits the scope. Thank you.
Very good. We'll look forward to receiving such an abstract. Yeah. I'll move on to a next question from Matthias Klum. Matthias, are you still here? Maybe you could elaborate on your question on comparing hospitals and airports and digitalization.
Yes, thank you. I'm in the train, so maybe there might be connection problems, but this is still quite stable. Thank you for organizing.
Yeah.
Thank you for organizing the workshop. It's really a major effort, and I welcome that. It's a good thing for this special issue. We would input some research which is going on in Germany, which is a very large-scale DFG project from the National Research Funding. And what we are doing is we are comparing actually hospitals and airports in their digitalization efforts. So we are doing empirical interviews with doctors and pilots. And for example, we have 3 interesting results. One showing interference for the efficiency of digital systems. So they tell us, you know, the more digital systems you have, there might be efficiency interference, which is an interesting theorem or hypothesis to me when we talk about efficiency gains from digitalization, you know, in operations. The second one is that the acceptance of digital systems is mainly triggered by the feeling to be in control. So this is very relevant for the workers on the ground in the operations to see if the digital system, if you talk about hospitals, if you talk about airlines, if they are really in control, like they have the possibility to maybe switch off a digital system, for example, or decide not to use it. So if it's an automatism that you have to use digital systems, there might be some efficiency or acceptance problems. And the third interesting result we already have, we have about half of the planned 100 interviews in. The third interesting thing is that in utilities and therefore, let's say, security sensitive areas, the acceptance of control by digital systems is much larger than in the normal businesses. So this means very operational sense. Doctors, pilots are accepting much more control by digital systems than maybe a normal logistics or operations person would do. And this is to us very interesting. And therefore my question, we would like, originally I have to admit, we thought about sending our research to organization science or something, but as I saw this special issue, I think it could be very interesting and maybe fitting your ideas. Thank you.
Anyone who wants to, or shall I take it? One of my main questions was initially the systems, maybe I missed it, but the digitalization that you refer to, is it more related to the assets, or is it, let's say, more directly related to the service processes that these professionals are engaged in? Because that would be an important question to determine whether it would be within the scope of the special issue.
Understood, and thank you. And actually, it's very much connected to the assets, because if you think about all the MRIs and all the airplanes they are using, they have increasingly digital and even AI systems included. And that's a major question for the operations perspective on it, if this is really productive or not. So therefore, I understand your, let's say, direction or perspective. It should be connected to assets, and yes, it is.
Yeah, perhaps I can add a little bit to this, although we have to move on because we got more coming up. So and indeed, it's real. When I saw airports, I thought, well, it's not about how a shop is run in the airport, but it's not. It's also when I saw a hospital, well, it's not about how a doctor uses digital information to schedule patients, but your topic isn't. So that's no issue. It is clearly there. I think it will be fascinating to learn how, in this context of asset management, digitization indeed changes the operations, changes the way they work. And I think anything that links to, I can understand your doubt. Is it organization size? Is it operations? Well, there's an overlap between these fields, of course, because operation is also a topic in organization science, and organization is a topic in operations management. But the more you leverage the findings from the operations side, the more fascinating it becomes. And you're using a utility right now to do your operations. So what more can a man ask, you know?
Yeah, great. Thank you for the feedback, Henk. Thank you.
Okay. Then moving to Nancy Ho. Nancy, are you still here? Your question on the...
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah.
Can you hear from me?
Yes, we can hear you. And your question is about whether the transportation, water, electricity challenge of operations of firms in developing countries will be within the scope of the special issue. Maybe that's also a question for Luc.
Oh, okay.
Yes, my answer would be yes, obviously, because these are huge problems in developing economies. And if you think about the population explosion that we are expecting in Africa and the consequences that will have on utilities and how to maintain them and how to deal with them, I would assume, yes, it would be a very interesting perspective, especially if you could elaborate on the differences with developed economies and how your design and sustainability issues would come into account in these developing economies type of problems. So I would say, yeah, but with the same comments that were made earlier by Win and Hank.
Oh, okay. I want to tell you more about my study. And at present, I found that in the developing countries, the firms face the challenge of infrastructure and the poor electricity and water supply restrain their development, and they didn't have a good operation in productivity growth. And we also found that the female shareholder in the firm can promote can diminish the and we also study the effect of female shareholder and the top manager's role in the progress. And we found these two moderators can give some help to reduce the negative effect of poor infrastructure on the poor impact of the negative impact of poor infrastructure on farms operation and performance. And my question is, do you think this is a good variable to study this question?
Nancy, I have a bit of a problem hearing and understanding you. I would suggest the best thing in this particular case would be for you to summarize on a one-pager the thing that you would think would be most appropriate, and we'll give you feedback on that. Is that okay?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I'll post our email addresses in the chat in a while, and we will also add them to the presentation that is going to be shared later on, so you can contact any of us after this meeting. Then there's a question from Brian Goodrich on his dissertation and the scope of that. Do you want to elaborate on that question, Brian?
Yes, good morning, everyone. All right, within the next 2 weeks, I'll be defending my dissertation. I'm a student at Jacksonville University, but I'm from Guyana, South America. And basically, I work on a power utility in Guyana, but my interest is in building resiliency for power utility. But due to the lack of data, I gathered data from the US, and I focus on building resiliency utilizing financial data for power utilities that are impacted by natural disaster in the context of hurricane. Of course, it was a 3-paper design dissertation that I did. Well, the first one dealt with utilizing the financial factor. The second one dealt with reliability, which focused on, in the context of the Caribbean, utilizing customer outage data for building reliability for power utility. And the third one is basically making a comparison between the financial factors and structural factors for power utility. So establish which one contributes more significantly to building resilience for power utility. So my question is, I want to know if this is something that we consider for the special issue.
I'm afraid the sound was dropping every now and then, Brian. But it sounds like a bit of a cop-out, but maybe the safest way is to also write down your proposal in a say 1 or 2 pager and send it to any of us, of all of us, so we could have a look. Hank, you have any additional?
Yeah, so Brian, it's obvious that this is within scope, so that's not a topic. This is utilities, power utilities, resilience, operations on it. So that there's we would love to see your proposal. The reason for having the proposal is that we can give more specific feedback, of course, on what will be within that scope, a more interesting area to look at. So that because it's in our joint interest that we get great submissions. But I would be very surprised if you would end up with something that we would have to say this doesn't fit, because it sounds straight in the core of what we're looking at.
Good. Then there's a question by Ali Reza, which is perhaps more of a methodological question. You want to elaborate on that, Ali Reza?
Yes. Hello, everybody, and good to be here, and thanks for the opportunity. And actually, we have submitted our paper to extended abstract actually to the EUROMA. So our research, we are from the Aalto University, and we are researching about this impact of digital twins and additive manufacturing in offshore wind farms maintenance and operations. So for the first level, so we have used some qualitative data, and also we followed an interplay between the design science approach and the qualitative interviews that we have collected. So what we had the interest to also add another level of analysis regarding this cost and time scenario analysis in some areas of our case, 2 cases that currently we have. So I wanted to ask that would this be in interest of this special issue and the guest editors, or on which direction we shall more focus actually? So this more qualitative or quantitative, or the both will be welcome. Thank you.
Anyone who wants to respond to that? Wendy?
Yeah, I can take that question if that's okay. So I think regarding methodologies, we are pretty much open to the majority of approaches that you could pick. And I guess for this specific question, whether you would need to focus on one or the other or both depends a lot on the type of message that you want to bring across and to what extent you can substantiate that with evidence from the various methods that you have just mentioned. So yeah, we can look into that, but just generally, whether it's a case study approach, whether it's design science, a combination, or other kinds of methods that you would like to employ, we're open to any of those. So please go ahead and take us further in what you have in mind.
If I can add a little bit to that, Wendy already said it, but just to emphasize, every research method has its strengths and weaknesses. So if your aim is to come, for instance, from a design science angle, with suggestions of design, of how you could do this better, then use design science. And if it's really an exploratory setting where you're not clear what direction things are heading for, then go for the exploratory case study. So if you have combinations that are more multi-method, then indeed look for the method that fit there. So it's the method that follows the topic and not the other way around as far as we are concerned. But of course, if you send us 1 or 2 pages, then we can be more specific, I'm sure, than just this general question. But all these this SI team already, and of course we have reviewers, has covered all the methodologies that you mentioned in the chat. So we're confident that we understand your question.
Thank you very much, and looking forward to meeting you in Berlin, actually.
Yeah. Well, we have plans. Yeah, several of us.
Very good.
See you there.
Yeah, maybe one comment. I think next to the reflections of Andy and Henk, I think a multi-method paper, as you're sort of implying, is definitely also interesting. It might stand out a bit more in terms of the method. There should be a good reason, and the good aspect is that they could complement each other and compensate each other's weaknesses. The risk of putting multi-methods in one paper, that there's more to dislike about each of the methods. So that's always something to keep in mind. Any other maybe impromptu questions triggered by this debate so far? I think we've covered all the questions in the chat.
Well,
Suzanne?
So coming back to the last question, then something that Tyson and I have discovered at the journal as a whole is that when people begin with a design science approach, it is harder to get the paper through the review process. Henk is actually one of the very few who has survived this, and Henk, I think it was not the easiest thing you've ever been through. So what we have discovered, and we've actually put a fair amount of thought into this, is that rather than design science, which is we're going to solve a problem, create something, and here it is, and 10 years from now we will have tested it and have some results. We have instead focused on intervention-based research. We have renamed the department from design science to intervention-based research, and we have Rogelio Oliva has written an article that really captures what is different, and then Aravind, Tyson, and I have kind of come in and added to that. And the focus of these editorials and articles has been to help authors dealing with exactly this question. So let's think about what would happen if, instead of saying, okay, my focus is on design science, which means we're going to create something and then we're going to try to find a place to test it, and then something is going to go wrong and somebody's going to quit, and then 100 years from now we actually get a chance to get actual feedback. Instead, we say, so we're going to do something. We are going to make an intervention. And this is what we expect is going to happen. And if that happens, great, go write a nice piece for an engineering journal. JOM is not the right place for it. But a lot of the time what happens, so the gold standard of theory testing is to go and try it out in practice. And if you're in a position where you're able to do that, you're going to learn a lot. And a lot of times what you learn ends up with your hair standing on end. You're like, I never would have thought of this. And this is where we move away from the deductive or inductive logic that typically drives research to abductive logic. Abductive logic says, I never would have thought this, but now that I've actually seen what happened, I've changed my thinking. I'm actually realizing I need to bring in a whole new element of theory. So it isn't, so at the journal, we define science as learning from observation. And you can learn a lot from qualitative observations. You can learn a lot from quantitative observations. But the important thing is, what do I know now that I have made this observation that I didn't know before? And when you look at what you observe through an intervention, we find that it's still not easy in the review process, but it's easier. So that's a brief summary, but for anybody who's interested in this, I would recommend taking a look at those, at the Rogelio Olivas paper and then our editorial.
Thanks for that addition. I just made a typo, but here comes the correct link to that editorial by Oliva. Yeah, for those of you interested. Any other questions from participants? No? Any final closing comments from my fellow guest editors before I hand over to Suzanne? No.
I may, if you don't mind, Finn. I
Sure.
think we're looking for real systems. We're looking for what is happening, and especially what Suzanne was saying, for surprising things that can hopefully teach us how we can do things better in the future. We talk about these very expensive long life assets, and so it doesn't really matter to me personally that what methodology you're using, as well as you using it for the right question and you're using it correctly. So I'm not bound on specific methodologies, but I think the question is very interesting. The question is the key, and then coming up with some surprising insights into that question. And even if you can't get the insights, at least if you can make people curious that we need more work in that particular area, that's also already something useful. But I don't want to speak for the editors, but this is my personal opinion. Yeah.
Well, I think that plea is on all of us. So I don't think there's reason to check. Yeah. So with that plea, let's close off. Thank you, everyone, for the questions and attending, and give the floor back to Suzanne.
Great. Well, thank you so much to all the guest editors for putting together this webinar. I'm sure that everybody has found it very useful. A recording will be made available on the journal website. And then also thank you very much to the guest editors for being willing to take an initial look on extended abstracts. Let me close with a little bit more advice just on what we are seeing about what tends to help a manuscript survive the review process. So one of our new departments is the public policy department, and what we're discovering is that when you look at public policy, there are established ways of doing things and thinking about things. But when you come in and you do systems thinking, you do process analysis, you observe things through an operations lens, suddenly you realize that here you've had these people who are completely stuck, unable, just talking past each other. One case we're looking at now, for 100 years. And you say, but if you look at it using systems thinking, then there's this whole solution space that nobody has seen. And by the way, we've also discovered some things that are really not working badly that everybody can agree on, and it brings them into the light. So I encourage you to use systems thinking, use process analysis, put that operations lens on, and then you end up with a paper that is not civil engineering. It is this is how we run our engineering operations better because we have applied operations management theory. And that is something which is doing well at the journal and that we kind of know how to support. So with that, I'll close, and thanks again to everyone. Have a great rest of the day.